Margaret Sullivan's knees hit the frozen ground outside the Harrison Creek Ranch, her 4 sons crying behind her in the broken wagon. 400 miles of dust and death had led her here. Her husband's grave was still fresh in Colorado. Her brother-in-law's words still burned. "You're not my problem anymore." $15. 4 hungry boys. And a blizzard rolling in across the Montana mountains. This is the story of how one woman's darkest moment became the doorway to everything she'd lost hope of finding. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon wheel cracked like a gunshot in the frozen air. Margaret Sullivan grabbed the seat to keep from being thrown, but the jolt sent her youngest 5-year-old Henry tumbling against the wooden side. His cry pierced the bitter wind. "Mama, I've got you, baby." Margaret pulled him close, her heart hammering. "I've got you. Ma, the wheel's done for." William, her eldest at 14, jumped down into the snow. He crouched by the broken wheel, his breath coming out in white clouds. Axles cracked clean through. Margaret closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough to push down the scream building in her chest. 400 miles. 400 miles of grief and dust and desperate hope, and now this. 3 miles from Silver Falls, Montana, the town where her brother-in-law Vernon lived, the town that was supposed to be their salvation. "Can we fix it?" Tommy, 11 years old and practical to his bones, climbed down beside his brother. Not without tools, not in this cold. William's voice was steady, but Margaret heard the fear underneath. Her boy had been trying to be a man since the day they'd buried his father. It broke her heart every time she looked at him. "Then we walk." Margaret made her voice firm. "It's only 3 miles. We'll make it before dark." "Mama, it's too cold." 8-year-old Benjamin pressed against her side. "Henry can't walk that far." "Then I'll carry him." "You can barely stand yourself," William said quietly. "You haven't eaten since yesterday." William Patrick Sullivan. Margaret fixed her son with a look that had stopped arguments for 14 years. "I said we walk. Now help your brothers down." They walked. The road to Silver Falls was nothing but a frozen track cutting through endless white. The wind bit through Margaret's threadbare coat, through the shawl she'd wrapped around Henry, through every layer of hope she had left. She carried Henry for the first mile. Then Tommy took him. Then William. They passed him back and forth like a package too precious to drop. And Margaret watched her sons struggle and said nothing, because what was there to say? Patrick was dead. The mine had collapsed 3 months ago, taking her husband and their future in one terrible moment of rock and darkness. She'd buried him in a Colorado mining camp, with nothing but a wooden cross to mark his grave, and then she'd loaded her 4 sons into their wagon and headed north. To Vernon, Patrick's older brother, the only family they had left. "He'll help us." Patrick had always said back when he was alive, and dreams still seemed possible. "Vernon's got that mercantile in Montana. Does well for himself. If anything ever happens to me, Maggie, you go to Vernon. He'll take care of you and the boys." She'd believed him. God help her, she'd believed him. Silver Falls appeared through the falling snow like a ghost town materializing from nothing. A main street of wooden buildings, a church steeple, a saloon with light spilling from its windows, and there, halfway down the street, a sign, Sullivan's Mercantile. "That's it," Margaret's voice cracked. "That's your uncle's store." "We made it," Tommy whispered. "Ma, we made it." They hadn't made it. Margaret would learn that soon enough. But for one moment, standing in the street with her 4 sons around her, she let herself believe they had. The Mercantile was warm. That was the first thing Margaret noticed when she pushed open the door. Warm and bright and full of the smell of coffee and leather and civilization. A man looked up from behind the counter. Vernon Sullivan. Older than she remembered, heavier with Patrick's nose, but none of Patrick's warmth in his eyes. "Can I help you?" He didn't recognize her. Of course he didn't. They'd only met twice at her wedding and at Patrick's mother's funeral. Vernon. Margaret stepped forward, her sons crowding behind her. It's Margaret, Patrick's wife. Vernon's face changed. Something flickered across it, surprise maybe, or something darker. He set down the ledger he'd been writing in. Margaret. He said her name like it tasted bitter. What are you doing here? Patrick is dead. The words came out flat. She'd said them so many times now, they'd lost their power to wound her. 3 months ago, a mine collapse in Colorado. I heard. Vernon's voice was careful. Got a letter from someone in the camp. Shame that. Shame. Her husband was dead, and it was a shame. I've come because we have nowhere else to go. Margaret forced herself to stand straight to meet his eyes. The boys and we need help. Just until I can find work, get on my feet. Patrick always said if anything happened. Patrick said a lot of things. Vernon interrupted. Most of them foolish. Running off to chase gold and silver instead of building something solid. Dragging a wife and children through mining camps like vagabonds. Margaret felt William stiffen beside her. She put a hand on his arm. I'm not asking for charity, she said quietly. I'm asking for family. Family? Vernon laughed, but there was no humor in it. Margaret, I barely know you. Met you twice in 15 years. And Patrick, he made his choices when he left. Cut himself off from everyone who loved him to chase dreams. That was his choice, not mine. He's dead, Vernon. Your brother is dead. And I'm sorry for it. Truly. Vernon didn't sound sorry. He sounded inconvenienced. But I've got my own family to think about. A wife, 2 daughters. Times are hard enough without taking on 4 extra mouths to feed. Henry started crying. Quiet, exhausted sobs that shook his small body. Tommy pulled him closer, trying to muffle the sound. Please. Margaret hated the word. Hated how it tasted, how it made her feel small. But she said it anyway because she had 4 sons who needed to eat. I'm begging you. Just a few weeks. I'll work. I'll do anything. Just don't turn us away. Vernon's jaw tightened. He glanced at the back of the store where Margaret could hear female voices. His wife. His daughters. The family he valued more than his dead brother's children. I can give you $20. He reached into his pocket. That's all I can spare. There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Patterson might rent you a room for a few nights. $20. Margaret stared at the bills he held out. Vernon, $20 won't last us a week. Then you'd better find work fast. He shoved the money toward her. Take it or leave it, but either way you can't stay here. Mama? William's voice was tight with anger. Let's go. Listen to your boy. Vernon's eyes were cold. Go on now. I've got a business to run. Margaret took the money. What choice did she have? She turned toward the door, her sons falling in behind her. 4 boys who'd just learned that family meant nothing when it was inconvenient. 4 boys who were watching their mother be humiliated by a man who shared their blood. Margaret. She stopped, but didn't turn around. There's a ranch about 15 miles west of here, Harrison Creek. The man who runs it, Caleb Harrison, he's been looking for help since his housekeeper quit. Might be worth asking. 15 miles. Margaret's voice was hollow. In this weather, with a broken wagon. Not my problem. Vernon's tone made it clear the conversation was over. Good luck to you. The door closed behind them with a sound like finality. Margaret stood in the street snow, falling on her shoulders, and felt something inside her crack. Not break, not yet, but crack like ice on a river just before it gives way. I hate him. William's hands were fisted at his sides. I hate him, Ma. Pa would never have... Your pa isn't here. The words came out sharper than Margaret intended. She softened her voice. I'm sorry, Will. I'm sorry you had to see that. But we can't waste time on hate. We need to focus on what comes next. What does come next? Tommy asked. He was holding Henry, who had stopped crying but was shivering violently. Ma, we can't stay outside. Henry's freezing. The boarding house. Margaret started walking. We'll get a room for tonight. Figure out the rest tomorrow. The boarding house was a narrow building with peeling paint and a crooked sign. Mrs. Patterson, a thin woman with suspicious eyes, looked them up and down when they came through the door. No room. Please. Margaret was so tired of that word. I can pay. I have money. I said no room. Mrs. Patterson's lip curled. I heard about you. Vernon Sullivan's sister-in-law come begging for charity. I run a respectable establishment. I don't take in vagrants with children. We're not vagrants. William stepped forward, his young face flushed with anger. Our father just died. We just need... I don't care what you need. Mrs. Patterson moved toward the door, clearly meaning to usher them out. Go on now. Try the saloon. Maybe they'll take pity on you. The saloon. She was suggesting Margaret take her 4 sons to a saloon. Please. The word was barely a whisper now. My boys are cold and hungry. Just one night. I'll pay double. You could pay triple, and I still wouldn't have room for the likes of you. Mrs. Patterson's voice carried, and Margaret realized others were watching. From doorways. From windows. The whole town, it seemed, had turned out to witness her humiliation. Ma. William's hand found hers. Come on, we'll find somewhere else. There was nowhere else. Margaret knew it, even as she let her son lead her back out into the cold. A town that had already decided who she was. A brother-in-law who'd washed his hands of them. $20 that wouldn't last a week, and 15 miles between them and the only hope left. The ranch. Margaret heard herself say it. Harrison Creek. That's 15 miles, Ma. Tommy's voice was small. In the snow, without a wagon. Then we'd better start walking. Margaret? An old man's voice came from behind her. She turned to see a weathered face beneath a battered hat. He was sitting on a bench outside the general store, watching them with eyes that held more kindness than she'd seen all day. Ma'am, he corrected himself, touching his hat. Couldn't help but overhear. You're looking for Harrison Creek. Yes. Margaret was too tired for suspicion, too desperate for wariness. Do you know it? Know it well. Caleb Harrison's a good man, fair employer. Lost his wife and baby years back, keeps to himself mostly, but he's decent. If he says he needs help, he means it. But 15 miles. Margaret looked at her boys. Tommy was carrying Henry, who had fallen asleep despite the cold. Benjamin was pressed against William, both of them shivering. I've got a wagon. The old man stood slowly, his joints creaking. Taking supplies out past Harrison's place tomorrow morning. Could give you a ride if you don't mind leaving early. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. The first kindness anyone had shown them since they'd arrived. Why, she had to ask, why would you help us? The old man's face softened. Because I had a daughter once. Husband died young, left her with 3 little ones. Nobody would help her either. His voice roughened. She didn't make it through that winter. Those children neither. I think about that sometimes. Think about all the folks who could have helped and didn't. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just let me help you now. He nodded toward a building down the street. There's a livery stable. Not much, but it's got a stove and hay for bedding. Man who runs it owes me a favor. You can stay there tonight, warm and dry. Leave first light tomorrow. Margaret opened her mouth to thank him, but no words came. Instead, tears slid down her cheeks hot against her frozen skin. None of that now. The old man's voice was gruff but gentle. Save your tears for happy times. You've got boys counting on you. What's your name? William asked. Ezra. Ezra Thornton. He smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had been. Now come on. Let's get you somewhere warm. The livery stable smelled of horses and hay and leather. It wasn't clean, and it wasn't comfortable, but there was a pot-bellied stove in the corner, throwing off heat, and Ezra found them blankets and even scared up some bread and cheese from somewhere. Margaret watched her boys eat, watched color slowly return to their faces, and felt the crack inside her seal just a little. Not fixed, nothing was fixed, but held together for one more day. "Thank you," she told Ezra when he came to check on them later. "I don't know how to repay you." "Don't need repayment." He settled onto a hay bale with a grunt. "Just pass it on someday. Help someone else when they need it." "I will, I promise." Ezra was quiet for a moment, watching the boys settle into the hay to sleep. William and Tommy on either side of Benjamin and Henry, a protective barrier against the world. "That brother-in-law of yours." Ezra's voice was carefully neutral. "Vernon Sullivan. He's got a reputation in this town." "What kind of reputation?" "The kind that makes a man rich and keeps him lonely." Ezra spat into the straw. "Cheats his customers, underpays his suppliers, treats his workers like dirt. Nobody likes him much, but he's the only mercantile for 50 miles, so folks put up with it." "Patrick wasn't like that." Margaret heard the defensiveness in her own voice. "My husband. He was Vernon's brother, but he wasn't like that at all." "I believe you." Ezra's eyes were kind. Sometimes the good seed and the bad seed grow right next to each other. Don't mean they're the same plant. Margaret lay awake long after Ezra left, listening to her sons breathe, watching firelight flicker on the wooden walls. Tomorrow, they would travel 15 miles to a ranch owned by a stranger, a man who'd lost his wife and child, a man who might turn them away just like everyone else. But what choice did she have? None. She had no choice. And maybe Margaret thought as exhaustion finally pulled her under. Maybe that was its own kind of freedom. When you had nothing left to lose, you could walk into anything, even 15 miles of frozen wilderness, even the unknown. Morning came gray and bitter, the sky heavy with clouds that promised more snow. Ezra was waiting with his wagon before dawn, his breath fogging in the cold air. "You sure about this?" he asked, as Margaret helped her boys into the wagon bed. "Harrison's a good man, but he's particular. Might not take kindly to strangers showing up at his door." "I'm sure." Margaret wasn't sure of anything except that she couldn't stay here, couldn't watch her sons freeze in a town that had already decided they weren't worth saving. The journey was long and cold. The road wound through hills covered in snow, past frozen creeks and stands of pine trees heavy with ice. Margaret held Henry on her lap, wrapped in every blanket they had, and tried not to think about what would happen if Caleb Harrison turned them away. There was nowhere else to go. If Harrison said no, they would die out here. It was that simple. "Ma." William's voice was quiet. "What was Pa really like, before the mines, I mean? Before things got hard?" Margaret looked at her eldest son, at the worry lines already forming on his young face, and felt her heart ache. "He was full of dreams," she said softly. "When I met him, he talked about all the things he was going to do, all the places we'd go. He made the whole world seem possible." "What happened?" "Life happened." Margaret stroked Henry's hair, watching him sleep. "Dreams are easy when you're young. Keeping them alive when things get hard, that's different. Your father tried. He never stopped trying, but sometimes trying isn't enough." "I won't be like that." William's voice was fierce. "When I grow up, I'll take care of you. Take care of all of us. I won't chase dreams and leave everyone behind." "Oh, Will." Margaret reached out to touch her son's face. "You're already taking care of us. Every day. I see it even when I don't say so." "Ma, look." Tommy pointed ahead. Through the falling snow, a gate appeared. Rough-hewn logs forming an arch over the road, with a brand burned into the crossbeam. H.C. Harrison Creek. "This is it." Ezra pulled the wagon to a stop. "Road goes on about a mile to the main house. I'd take you all the way, but I've got deliveries waiting." "You've done more than enough." Margaret climbed down from the wagon, then helped her boys out one by one. "Thank you, Ezra, for everything. Just remember what I said." Ezra's eyes were serious. "Pass it on. And Margaret, don't let this place fool you. It looks rough, but Harrison's got a good heart. He's just forgotten how to show it. The wagon rolled away, leaving them alone at the gate. Margaret looked at her sons, at their thin faces and hopeful eyes, and felt the weight of everything resting on what happened next. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," William said. Tommy nodded. Benjamin squared his small shoulders. Henry, still half asleep, just clung to her hand. They walked through the gate and up the road toward whatever waited at the end. The ranch house appeared through the snow, like something from a dream. Bigger than Margaret had expected, with a wide porch and smoke rising from multiple chimneys. Barns and outbuildings clustered around it, and even through the storm she could see cattle in the distance, dark shapes against the white. A man emerged from the nearest barn as they approached. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent his life on horseback. He stopped when he saw them, his hand resting near his hip, where a gun belt hung. "Can I help you folks?" Margaret's throat tightened. This was it. This was the moment. "My name is Margaret Sullivan." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm looking for Caleb Harrison." "You found him." The man stepped closer, and Margaret could see his face now. Weathered, handsome, in a hard way, with gray-blue eyes that gave nothing away. "What brings you to my ranch, Mrs. Sullivan?" "I'm looking for work." Margaret lifted her chin. "I heard you need a housekeeper." Caleb Harrison's eyes moved from her to the wagon that wasn't there, to the 4 boys huddled behind her, to the falling snow that was quickly turning into a full blizzard. "Where's your wagon?" "Broke down 3 miles outside Silver Falls. We walked." "Walked?" Something flickered in those gray eyes. "From Silver Falls, in this weather, with 4 children." "Yes." "Why?" Margaret could have lied, could have made up a story about opportunity and adventure. But she was too tired for lies, too desperate for pretense. "Because we had nowhere else to go." The words came out raw. "My husband died 3 months ago. His brother refused to help us. The town refused to give us shelter. A man named Ezra Thornton brought us here because he said you were looking for help, and you were decent." She paused, drew a breath. "I can cook. I can clean. I can sew and keep books and teach children to read. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Harrison. I just need a chance. One chance. For me and my boys." The wind howled around them. Snow stung Margaret's face, found its way beneath her collar. Henry was crying again, too cold and tired to hold it in anymore. Caleb Harrison looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her sons. At William, trying so hard to be brave. At Tommy, calculating their odds. At Benjamin, pressed close to his brothers. At Henry, sobbing in the cold. "You walked 15 miles. His voice was quiet. "In a blizzard. With 4 children. Because you had no other choice." "Yes." "And if I turn you away, what then?" Margaret met his eyes. "Then I'll walk 15 miles back, and I'll find another way. Because that's what mothers do." Caleb Harrison stared at her. The silence stretched between them, filled only by wind and Henry's cries and the pounding of Margaret's heart. Then he turned toward the house. "Mrs. Abernathy." His voice carried through the storm. "We've got guests. Put on coffee and heat up some stew." He looked back at Margaret, and for the first time something like warmth appeared in those gray eyes. "Come on inside, Mrs. Sullivan. You're home now." The warmth hit Margaret like a physical force when she stepped through the door. Heat from a massive stone fireplace, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, the golden glow of oil lamps against the darkness outside. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her. "Steady now." Caleb's hand caught her elbow, firm but gentle. "Mrs. Abernathy, where's that coffee?" A woman appeared from somewhere deeper in the house. 60 years old at least, with silver hair tucked under a white cap, and eyes that crinkled at the corners when she saw the children. "Lord have mercy." Her voice was soft, horrified. "Mr. Harrison, these babies are half frozen." "I know." Caleb was already helping Henry out of his snow-covered coat. Get blankets, warm ones. And that stew needs to be hot, not warm. I'm on it. Mrs. Abernathy moved with surprising speed for her age. You poor dears. Come here, come to the fire. That's right. Don't be shy now. Margaret watched her sons be shepherded toward the fireplace, watched blankets appear as if by magic, watched steaming bowls of stew materialize in small trembling hands. She should move, should help, should do something besides stand here like a statue. But she couldn't. The relief was too overwhelming. The simple kindness of warmth and food and shelter, after so many hours of cold and rejection, it unmade her completely. Mrs. Sullivan? Caleb's voice was close. Margaret. She looked up at him and, to her horror, felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She couldn't stop them, couldn't even raise her hand to wipe them away. I'm sorry. The words came out broken. I'm not usually like this. I'm stronger than this. You just walked 15 miles through a blizzard with 4 children. Caleb's voice held no judgment. I'd be worried if you weren't crying. He guided her to a chair near the fire, pressed a cup of hot coffee into her hands. Margaret wrapped her fingers around it, let the heat seep into her frozen bones, and tried to remember how to breathe. Mama! Henry's small voice cut through her fog. Mama, are you sad? No, baby. Margaret managed a smile. I'm not sad. I'm just very, very tired. The nice man gave us soup. Henry held up his bowl as evidence. It's got meat in it. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Eat up. She watched her boys eat, watched color slowly return to their faces, and felt something loosen in her chest. They were safe. At least for tonight, they were safe. Mrs. Sullivan. Mrs. Abernathy appeared at her elbow. You need to eat too. When did you last have a proper meal? Margaret tried to remember. Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe the day before. Mrs. Abernathy's face tightened with something like anger, though not directed at Margaret. That brother-in-law of yours, Vernon Sullivan. I've heard of him. You have nothing good. Mrs. Abernathy pressed a bowl into Margaret's hands. Eat. You're no use to those boys if you collapse from hunger. The stew was thick with beef and potatoes and carrots. Margaret ate slowly, her shrunken stomach protesting, and listened to the sounds around her. Her boys' voices growing livelier as warmth and food did their work. Mrs. Abernathy bustling about, clucking over the state of their clothes, the fire crackling, and underneath it all, Caleb Harrison's steady presence. He'd settled into a chair across the room, watching everything with those unreadable gray eyes. Not intruding, not demanding anything, just there. Mr. Harrison. Margaret set down her empty bowl. I meant what I said, about working. I don't expect charity. I know you don't. Caleb's voice was calm. We can discuss arrangements tomorrow. Tonight you rest. But tomorrow. His tone left no room for argument. Mrs. Abernathy, is the guest room ready? It will be in 10 minutes. Good. Caleb stood. Mrs. Sullivan, you and your boys will stay in the main house tonight. There's a cabin behind the house that we use for staff, but it needs airing out. Tomorrow, if we come to an agreement about employment, that'll be yours. A cabin. William spoke up for the first time since they'd entered. A whole cabin, just for us. 2 bedrooms, a sitting room, and a kitchen. Caleb looked at the boy. You're the eldest. Yes, sir. William. Will. How old? 14, sir. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Respect, maybe. You did good today, Will. Taking care of your brothers. Your father would be proud. William's face crumpled for just a moment before he got control of it. Thank you, sir. Margaret's heart ached. Her boy, her strong, brave boy, who needed to hear those words from a man, who hadn't heard them since Patrick died. The guest room was small but clean, with 2 beds and a fire already burning in the small hearth. Margaret tucked her boys in, listening to their sleepy murmurs, feeling their foreheads for any sign of fever from the cold. "Mama," Tommy's voice was drowsy. "Is this real? Are we really staying here?" "For tonight, yes." "What about tomorrow?" "Tomorrow I'll talk to Mr. Harrison about work." Margaret smoothed his hair back from his face. "We'll figure it out, Tommy. We always do." "I like it here." Benjamin's voice came from the other bed. "It smells like horses, and the lady gave us extra bread. Her name is Mrs. Abernathy. We'll thank her properly tomorrow." "Mama." Henry's small hand found hers in the darkness. The tall man. Is he nice?" Margaret thought about Caleb Harrison, his gruff voice and guarded eyes, the way he'd caught her elbow when she'd stumbled, the simple words, "You're home now." "Yes, baby, I think he's nice." She lay awake long after her sons fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. Somewhere in this house, Caleb Harrison was doing the same thing probably. Lying awake, wondering what he'd gotten himself into by inviting a desperate widow and her 4 children under his roof. Tomorrow she would prove herself. Tomorrow she would show him she was worth the risk. Tomorrow. Morning came with watery gray light and the smell of bacon drifting up from below. Margaret woke to find her boys already stirring, drawn by the scent of food, like moths to flame. "Get dressed," she told them, pulling on her own worn dress and trying to smooth the wrinkles. "And wash your faces properly. First impressions matter." "We already made a first impression," William pointed out. "We showed up half frozen and crying." "Then second impressions matter even more." Mrs. Abernathy was in the kitchen when they came down, moving between stove and table with practiced efficiency. She looked up and smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "There you are. Sit down, sit down. Breakfast is almost ready." "Can we help?" Margaret asked. "I don't want to just—" "You can help tomorrow." Mrs. Abernathy waved her toward a chair. "Today you recover. Those boys need a proper meal, and so do you." The breakfast was enormous. Bacon and eggs and biscuits and gravy coffee for Margaret and milk for the boys. Margaret watched her sons eat and felt that loosening sensation in her chest again. When had they last had enough? When had she stopped noticing their hollow cheeks and thin wrists? Caleb appeared as they were finishing stamping snow off his boots in the doorway. He'd clearly been up for hours working despite the weather. His cheeks were red from cold, his hair damp with melted snow. "Mrs. Sullivan?" He nodded to her. "When you're finished, I'd like to talk. My study's down the hall." "Of course." Margaret stood immediately, but Caleb held up a hand. "Finish your coffee first. I've got paperwork to do. Take your time." He disappeared down the hall and Margaret sat back down, her heart hammering. "He seems stern," Tommy said quietly. "Is he angry?" "He's not angry." Mrs. Abernathy's voice was warm. "That's just his way. Mr. Harrison's not much for words or smiles, but he's a good man, the best I've ever worked for." "How long have you been here?" Margaret asked. "Going on 8 years now." Mrs. Abernathy refilled her coffee. "Came after my husband died. Mr. Harrison gave me a job when nobody else would hire a woman my age, gave me a home when I had nowhere to go." Something in her tone made Margaret look up. "You know what it's like, being desperate." "I do." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes were kind. "That's why I spoke up for you last night. When Mr. Harrison asked what I thought about taking you on, I told him you had spine. Told him anyone who walked 15 miles through a blizzard with 4 children wasn't going to quit when things got hard. You spoke up for me. Someone had to, and I wasn't wrong, was I?" Margaret shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Now go on." Mrs. Abernathy shooed her toward the door. "Don't keep him waiting. I'll look after your boys." The study was a small room, lined with books, and smelling of leather and tobacco. Caleb sat behind a scarred wooden desk, papers spread before him. He looked up when Margaret entered and gestured to a chair across from him. "Sit down, please." Margaret sat folding her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. "I'm going to be direct with you." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "I do need help. Mrs. Abernathy's getting older, and the work is too much for one person. During roundup season, we've got 20 men to feed. Even in winter, there's more than she can handle alone. I can help with that. I've cooked for large groups before." "I believe you." Caleb's eyes studied her face. "But I need to know what I'm taking on. You show up at my door with 4 children. No wagon, no supplies, nothing but the clothes on your back. What happened? And I don't mean the short version you gave me last night. I mean everything." Margaret drew a breath. He deserved the truth. All of it. "I married Patrick Sullivan when I was 19. He was charming, full of dreams, convinced he was going to strike it rich out west. I believed him." She paused. "For the first few years it was good. Hard, but good. We moved from camp to camp following the gold, then the silver. Will was born in California, Tommy in Nevada, Benjamin in Utah, Henry in Colorado. That's a lot of moving. Patrick couldn't stay in one place. Always convinced the next town would be better, the next mine would pay off, and I followed him because that's what wives do." Margaret's voice hardened slightly. "Or what I thought wives did back then. What changed? Everything. Nothing." Margaret looked down at her hands. "The dreams never came true, but Patrick kept chasing them. We got poorer. The boys got older. I got tired. By the end, I think we were both just going through the motions." "But you stayed." "Where was I going to go? I had 4 children and no money. No skills except keeping house and teaching. And there aren't many teaching jobs in mining camps." Margaret met his eyes. "I'm not proud of it, Mr. Harrison. I stayed because I was scared, because I didn't know how to do anything else." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "And then he died." "Mine collapse. 3 months ago." Margaret's voice was steady now. "It happened fast. They said he didn't suffer." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I mourned him. Still do sometimes. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't relief mixed in with the grief." She lifted her chin, daring him to judge her. "My husband was a good man in many ways, but he was a terrible provider. He chased dreams while his children went hungry. I can mourn him and be angry at him at the same time. That's honest. I don't have energy for lies anymore, Mr. Harrison. I've got 4 boys who need me to be strong enough for all of us. That doesn't leave room for pretending." Caleb nodded slowly. "What happened with Vernon?" "He refused to take us in. Said Patrick made his choices years ago, and he wasn't responsible for the consequences." Margaret's jaw tightened at the memory. "Gave me $20 and told me to try the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson turned you away." "How did you know?" "I know Eleanor Patterson." Caleb's voice was dry. "She only takes guests who improve her reputation. A widow with 4 children isn't respectable enough for her establishment. She called us vagrants." Something dark flickered across Caleb's face. "I see. Ezra Thornton helped us, gave us shelter in the livery stable overnight, brought us here this morning. If not for him—" Margaret stopped, unable to finish. "Ezra's good people." Caleb's voice had softened. "Lost his daughter and grandchildren years back. Similar situation to yours. He's never forgiven himself for not helping more. He told me. Some of it." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, Margaret could hear her boys' voices laughing at something. The sound made her chest tight. "Here's what I'm thinking." Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "I'll hire you as assistant housekeeper. You'll work alongside Mrs. Abernathy, learn how we do things here, help with cooking and cleaning and whatever else needs doing. Pay is $30 a month plus room and board for you and your boys." Margaret's breath caught. $30 was more than she'd dared hope for. The cabin out back will be yours. It needs work, but it's solid. 2 bedrooms, wood stove running water from the pump. Not fancy, but comfortable. Mr. Harrison, I don't know what to say. I'm not finished. Caleb held up a hand. Your boys. The older ones need something to do. I'll have my foreman Charlie teach them ranch work if they're willing. Nothing dangerous, just basics. The younger 2 can help with small chores, collecting eggs, feeding the dogs, that sort of thing. You'd do that. Idle boys get into trouble. Besides, Caleb's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. A boy needs to learn things. Needs men around to teach him. Your eldest will, he's been carrying weight no 14-year-old should carry. Maybe time to let some of that weight shift. Margaret felt tears threatening again. She blinked them back furiously. I have one condition, Caleb continued. I heard you used to teach school. Yes, before I married. There's no school within 50 miles of here. The children on my ranch and the neighboring spreads, they've got no education. I've been thinking about starting a small school right here on the property. He paused. Would you be willing to teach? Not every day, maybe 3 or 4 times a week. The housework would come first, but if you could spare the time. A school. Her own school. Yes. The word came out fierce, certain. Yes, I would be willing. More than willing. Then we have a deal. Caleb stood extending his hand. Welcome to Harrison Creek Ranch, Mrs. Sullivan. Margaret stood and took his hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused from years of work. She looked into his gray-blue eyes and saw something there that hadn't been there before. Not warmth exactly, but openness. A willingness to see where this went. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. You won't regret this. Caleb. He released her hand. If you're going to work here, you might as well use my name. Then call me Margaret. Margaret. He said it carefully, like he was testing the weight of it. All right then, let's go tell your boys the good news. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the best of Margaret's life. The work was relentless. She rose before dawn to help Mrs. Abernathy prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. 7 men who ate like they hadn't seen food in days. Then there was cleaning laundry, mending, and the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch house running. By evening, she fell into bed, exhausted, muscles aching in places she hadn't known she had muscles. But she was happy. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, Margaret was genuinely happy. The boys thrived. Will spent his afternoons with Charlie McBride, the ranch foreman, learning to rope and ride and handle horses with quiet competence. Tommy discovered a talent for numbers and started helping Mrs. Abernathy with the household accounts. Benjamin found a litter of kittens in the barn and appointed himself their protector. And Henry. Sweet little Henry followed everyone around like a duckling, collecting hugs and treats and becoming the unofficial mascot of the Harrison Creek Cowboys. Your boys are good ones, Charlie told her one evening as she watched Will practice his roping on a fence post. Will especially. Got a natural seat on a horse. Quiet hands. The horses trust him. His father never taught him to ride. The admission came out before Margaret could stop it. Patrick wasn't much for practical things. Well, he's learning now. That's what matters. Charlie tipped his hat. Ma'am. And then there was Caleb. She saw him every day at meals and in passing discussing household matters and ranch business. He was unfailingly polite, unfailingly fair, and utterly impossible to read. Those gray eyes gave nothing away. That weathered face could have been carved from stone for all the emotion it showed. But sometimes Margaret caught glimpses of something else. The way he watched her boys playing in the yard. A softness around his mouth that was almost like longing. The way he asked after her welfare, gruff questions that betrayed more concern than he probably intended. The way he'd brought books home from town one day, left them on the kitchen table, without a word, exactly the ones she'd mentioned wanting to read. He likes you, Mrs. Abernathy said one afternoon as they rolled out pie crust together. Mr. Harrison? Don't look at me like that, I've got eyes. He's my employer. And And nothing. Margaret pressed the rolling pin harder than necessary. I'm a widow with 4 children and nothing to my name. He's well, he's him. Rich respected could have any woman in the territory. Could but doesn't. Mrs. Abernathy's voice was gentle. You know why he never remarried? After Rose died? Margaret had heard the story. Everyone had heard the story. Caleb Harrison's young wife dead in childbirth while he was away selling cattle. The baby, a little girl who'd followed her mother hours later. Caleb had come home to 2 fresh graves and a silence that had never quite lifted. He blamed himself. Mrs. Abernathy continued. Still does, I think. Believes if he'd been here, he could have saved them. That guilt it's eaten at him for 10 years. That's terrible. It is. But Margaret. Mrs. Abernathy stopped rolling and looked at her directly. I've worked for that man for 8 years. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. You're imagining things. I'm old, not blind. Mrs. Abernathy returned to her pie crust. Just think about it. That's all I'm saying. Margaret thought about it. That night, lying in her bed in the little cabin that had become home, she thought about it until her head ached. She thought about Patrick, about the dreams that had slowly curdled into disappointment. She thought about all the years she'd spent hoping things would get better, would be different, would somehow transform into the life she'd imagined when she was 19 and in love. And she thought about Caleb Harrison, his steady hands and quiet strength, the way he treated her like an equal, not a burden, the way he'd opened his home to her family when he had no reason to, when everyone else had turned away. She wasn't in love with him. She barely knew him. But something was stirring in her chest, something warm and frightening and full of possibility. It was too soon, too fast, too much. But lying there in the darkness, Margaret couldn't help wondering what it would feel like to not be alone anymore. The school opened in early December in a converted storage building that the ranch hands had spent weeks preparing. Margaret had 12 students on the first day, ranging from a 6-year-old ranch hand's daughter to a strapping 15-year-old boy who could barely write his own name. I don't know about this. The 15-year-old Jake stood awkwardly by the door. I'm too old for school. You're never too old to learn. Margaret gestured to a seat. Come on in. I promise not to make you sit with the little ones. Teaching fed something in Margaret's soul that had been starving. She'd forgotten how much she loved it. The challenge of reaching each student, the joy of watching understanding dawn on a struggling face, the simple pleasure of sharing knowledge. Caleb stopped by one afternoon, standing in the doorway, and watching as Margaret helped little Sarah Patterson sound out words from a primer. Margaret looked up, caught his eye, and felt her cheeks warm. Don't mind me. He stepped back. Just checking on things. But he came back the next day, and the day after that, always with some excuse, bringing firewood or checking on supplies, always staying just a few minutes watching Margaret teach with an expression she couldn't quite name. You're good with them, he said one evening when the students had gone home and Margaret was cleaning the small schoolhouse. Natural teacher. I love it. Margaret set down her broom. I'd forgotten how much. These past years just trying to survive, I'd forgotten there were things I actually enjoyed. That happens. Caleb's voice was quiet. When you're just getting through each day, you lose track of who you used to be. Is that what happened to you after Rose? The name hung in the air between them. Margaret hadn't meant to say it, had promised herself she wouldn't pry into his past. Yes. Caleb didn't seem angry, just tired. I lost myself for a long time. The ranch kept me moving, gave me something to do with my hands, but inside I was hollow. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was a long time ago. He paused. You're the first person to say her name to me in years. Most people tiptoe around it like if they mention her, she'll somehow get more dead. Does it help talking about her? I don't know. I've never tried. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and Margaret felt that warmth in her chest again. Maybe with the right person it would. They stood there, close enough to touch, but not touching, and Margaret felt something shift between them. Some wall coming down, some door opening. I should go. She stepped back suddenly, aware of how late it was, how quiet the ranch had become. The boys will be wondering where I am. Of course. Caleb moved toward the door, then stopped. Margaret. Yes. Thank you, for what you've done here, for the school, for the boys, for everything. This place feels different since you came. More alive. You gave us a home when no one else would. I should be thanking you. We saved each other, maybe. His voice was so soft, she almost missed it. Good night, Margaret. Good night, Caleb. She walked back to her cabin through the cold December darkness, her heart beating faster than it should have been, her mind full of things she wasn't ready to name. But for the first time since Patrick died, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret felt like maybe, just maybe, the future held something besides survival. Maybe it held joy. Christmas came to Harrison Creek Ranch with the smell of pine boughs and cinnamon, with laughter echoing through halls that had been silent for too long. Margaret watched her boys hang handmade decorations on the tree Caleb had cut himself and felt her heart swell until it hurt. Higher, Will, Henry commanded from his perch on Tommy's shoulders. The star goes at the very top. I'm trying. Will stretched on his toes, tongue poking out in concentration. Almost. Got it. The star, fashioned from tin and painted gold by Benjamin, settled crookedly on the highest branch. Everyone cheered, even Caleb, who stood in the doorway with something like wonder on his face. Hasn't been a tree in this house for 10 years. Mrs. Abernathy murmured, coming to stand beside Margaret. Not since Rose passed. He couldn't bear it. Margaret looked at Caleb, at the way his eyes followed her boys, at the softness in his expression that he probably didn't know was there. Things change, she said quietly. They do. Mrs. Abernathy squeezed her arm. Sometimes for the better. Christmas morning brought presents Margaret couldn't afford but had made anyway. Knitted scarves for the boys sewn from yarn Mrs. Abernathy had pressed into her hands. A carved wooden horse for Henry, whittled by Charlie during the long winter evenings. And from Caleb, gifts that made Margaret's breath catch. New boots for each of the boys, perfectly sized. A warm coat for Will, thick enough to keep out the Montana cold. Books for Tommy, who devoured them like food. Art supplies for Benjamin, who'd been sketching on any scrap of paper he could find. This is too much, Margaret protested, watching her sons tear into their gifts with unrestrained joy. You shouldn't have. I wanted to. Caleb's voice was gruff, but his eyes were warm. They deserve it. But, Margaret. He said her name like it meant something. Let them have this. Let yourself have this. She did. She let herself have the hot chocolate and the carols, the laughter and the warmth, the feeling of family that she'd almost forgotten existed. And when Caleb caught her eye across the room and smiled, actually smiled, she let herself have that too. January brought bitter cold and something else. Something that changed everything. It started with a cough. Nothing serious, Margaret thought at first. Just winter in Montana, dry air and cold nights. Half the ranch hands were coughing. It would pass, but it didn't pass. By the second week of January, 3 men were down with fever. By the third week, it was 7. Mrs. Abernathy moved them all to the bunkhouse, quarantined them as best she could, and worked herself to exhaustion trying to care for them. Influenza, she told Margaret grimly. Bad strain. We lost men to this same sickness back in '75. Margaret kept her boys away from the bunkhouse, kept them busy with lessons and chores, and tried not to let them see her fear. But at night when they were asleep, she lay awake and listened to the wind howl and prayed to God that this cup would pass them by. It didn't. Caleb didn't come to breakfast on a Thursday morning. He's just busy, Charlie said when Margaret asked. But Charlie's eyes wouldn't meet hers, and his voice held a note of worry that made her stomach clench. By afternoon, the truth was unavoidable. Caleb Harrison was burning with fever, delirious, barely conscious. The sickness that had swept through his ranch had finally reached him. "I'll tend to him," Mrs. Abernathy said, already gathering supplies. "You stay away, Margaret. You've got children to think of. You're exhausted. You've been nursing the men for weeks. I can manage. You can barely stand." Margaret took the supplies from her hands. "Go rest. I'll take the first shift." "Margaret, my children need me alive. I know that." Margaret's voice was steady, even as her heart raced. "But they also need a home. And if Caleb dies because no one was strong enough to care for him, what happens to us then?" It was a brutal calculation, and Margaret hated herself for making it. But it was also true. Their survival depended on Caleb Harrison's survival. That was simple fact. What wasn't simple was the other truth, the one she hadn't admitted to anyone, barely admitted to herself. She couldn't bear the thought of him dying. Not because of what it would mean for her family, but because of what it would mean for her heart. Caleb's bedroom was dark, and too warm, the air thick with sickness. He lay tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, his face flushed, his breathing harsh and labored. Margaret had never seen him look so vulnerable, this man who seemed carved from granite, reduced to fevered trembling. "Caleb?" She sat on the edge of his bed, pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened, glassy and unfocused. "Rose." Margaret's chest tightened. "No, it's Margaret." "Rose." His hand found hers, gripped with surprising strength. "Don't leave. Please don't leave me again." "I'm not leaving." Margaret blinked back tears. "I'm right here." She stayed through that night and the next day and the night after that. She bathed his face and changed his sheets and dripped water past his cracked lips. She listened to him cry out for his dead wife, for his lost baby, for forgiveness from God and himself. And somewhere in those endless hours, Margaret stopped pretending she didn't love him. It was foolish. She knew that. She'd known him 3 months. She was a widow with 4 children and nothing to offer. He was her employer, her benefactor, a man so wrapped in grief that he probably couldn't see her as anything but a housekeeper. But the heart doesn't listen to reason. The heart wants what it wants. And Margaret's heart wanted Caleb Harrison. On the 3rd night, his fever broke. Margaret was dozing in the chair beside his bed when she heard him stir. She jerked awake, instantly alert, and found him watching her with clear eyes. "Margaret." His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "What are you doing here?" "Taking care of you." She poured water from the pitcher by his bed. "Here, drink." He drank, his throat working, then sank back against the pillows. "How long?" 3 days. Your fever broke about an hour ago." "The men?" "Recovering. Everyone's recovering. Mrs. Abernathy's taking care of them." "And your boys?" Margaret's eyes burned. Of course that was his first question. Of course he thought of her children before himself. "They're fine. Healthy. Worried about you, but fine." "Good." His eyes drifted closed. "That's good." "Caleb." Margaret's voice cracked. "You scared me half to death." He opened his eyes again, really looking at her this time, taking in her exhaustion, her tear-streaked face, the way she was clutching his hand like she was afraid to let go. "You've been here the whole time." It wasn't a question. Someone had to be. Mrs. Abernathy could have. Mrs. Abernathy needed rest. And I. Margaret stopped, unsure how to finish. "And you?" Caleb's thumb traced circles on her palm. "Why did you stay, Margaret?" "Because I was terrified you would die. Because I realized I love you. Because the thought of losing you made me understand that I've already lost too much, and I can't lose anything else." "Because you would have done the same for me," she said instead. Something shifted in his expression. "I would have. I would do anything for you, Margaret." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "You should rest," she managed. "We can talk when you're stronger." "No." Caleb's grip tightened on her hand. I've spent 10 years not talking, not saying what needed to be said. And then I nearly died without ever telling you. He broke off coughing. Telling me what? That you've changed everything. His voice was raw, stripped of all defenses. That when you showed up at my door with your boys, desperate and half-frozen, something woke up in me that I thought was dead. That every day since then, I've found reasons to see you, to talk to you, to be near you. That I lie awake at night, thinking about you, and I feel guilty because Rose has only been gone 10 years, and I shouldn't feel this way about anyone else, but I do. I do, Margaret. God help me, I do. Margaret couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at this man who'd just torn his heart open and laid it at her feet. Caleb. I know it's too soon. He rushed on as if afraid she'd stop him. I know you're still grieving Patrick. I know you've got 4 boys to think of, and the last thing you need is some broken rancher complicating your life. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know. Before I die, before... You're not dying. The words came out fierce. Do you hear me, Caleb Harrison? You are not dying. I know. And it's not too soon. Margaret heard herself say it and knew it was true. Patrick was my husband, but I mourned our marriage long before he died. I loved who he was in the beginning, but that man disappeared years ago. What we had at the end wasn't love. It was just endurance. Margaret. I stayed with him because I had no choice. Because I was scared and trapped and couldn't see any other way. She was crying now, tears sliding down her cheeks. But I have a choice now. You gave me that. You gave me a home and work and dignity. You gave my boys a future. And somewhere along the way, without meaning to, without even realizing it, you gave me something else. What? Hope. The word broke on a sob. Hope that maybe I could have something more than just survival. That maybe I deserved to be happy. That maybe there was someone out there who could see me, really see me, not just as a burden or a problem to be solved. Caleb reached up his hand, trembling with weakness, and touched her face. Brushed the tears from her cheek with his thumb. I see you, he said quietly. I've seen you from the moment you walked through my door. Then you know how scared I am. Margaret pressed her face into his palm. I've lost so much, Caleb. I've been let down so many times. I don't know if I can survive losing again. Neither do I. His voice was honest, unflinching. I lost Rose and our baby, and it nearly destroyed me. The thought of loving someone else, of risking that kind of pain again, it terrifies me. So what do we do? Caleb was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady, despite his weakness. We take it slow. We learn each other. We let whatever this is grow at its own pace, without pressure or expectations. He paused. And we're honest with each other. About our fears, our pasts, our doubts, all of it. What if it doesn't work out? What if we try and it falls apart? I work for you, Caleb. I live in your cabin. If things go wrong, they won't go wrong. He said it with such certainty that Margaret almost believed him. But even if they did, you'd still have a place here, you and your boys. That's not dependent on anything between us. I promise you that. How can you promise something like that? Because I know what it's like to be abandoned when you're vulnerable. His eyes were fierce. Vernon Sullivan turned you away when you needed him most. I won't be that man, Margaret. No matter what happens between us, you'll always have a home here. Always. Margaret looked at him. At this man who'd been broken by loss and had somehow rebuilt himself. At his gray-blue eyes so guarded for so long, now open and vulnerable. At his weathered face, softened by something that looked like hope. Yes, she whispered. Yes. Yes, I want to try. Yes, I want to see where this goes. Yes to all of it. She laughed through her tears. I must be crazy. If you're crazy, so am I. Caleb pulled her closer, and she let herself lean into him, careful of his weakness. We'll be crazy together. They stayed like that for a long time. Not kissing, not making declarations. Just holding each other while the fire crackled and the wind howled outside. Two people who'd been alone for too long finally admitting they didn't have to be anymore. Recovery was slow. Caleb chafed at the forced rest, wanting to be up and working, but Margaret and Mrs. Abernathy kept him in bed with a combination of stern words and strategic deployment of his favorite foods. "You're worse than the boys," Margaret told him, pushing him back against the pillows when he tried to get up on the 5th day. "At least they listen when I tell them to stay put. I've got a ranch to run. Charlie's got the ranch. You've got a fever that still spikes every evening. It's getting better. And it'll get better faster if you rest." Margaret fixed him with a look that had quelled 4 sons for years. "Don't make me get Mrs. Abernathy." Caleb subsided, grumbling, but there was warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. They talked during those days. Really talked, in ways they hadn't before. Margaret told him about her childhood in Ohio, about the dreams she'd had before she'd married Patrick, and let those dreams fade. Caleb told her about his parents, about building the ranch, about Rose and the baby, and the guilt that still gnawed at him in the quiet hours. "I wasn't there," he said one evening, his voice rough with old pain. "She needed me, and I wasn't there. I keep thinking if I'd just stayed home, if I hadn't been so focused on that cattle sale." "You couldn't have known." Margaret took his hand. "These things happen, Caleb. Women die in childbirth even when their husbands are right there. It's terrible and unfair, and it makes no sense. But it's not your fault. My head knows that. My heart doesn't. Then we'll work on your heart." She squeezed his fingers. Together. The boys noticed the change between them, of course. Children always noticed. "Mama." Tommy approached her one evening, his face serious. "Are you and Mr. Harrison together?" Margaret considered lying, then decided against it. Tommy was 11, old enough for truth. "We're getting to know each other better, seeing if we might suit. Like courting, something like that." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "Is he going to be our new father?" "I don't know, sweetheart. It's too early to say." "I wouldn't mind." Tommy's voice was small. "If he was, I mean. He's nice. He teaches me things and doesn't get mad when I ask too many questions. Pa used to get mad." Margaret's heart ached. "I know he did." "I loved Pa." Tommy looked up at her, his eyes too old for his face. "But he wasn't always easy to love. Mr. Harrison feels steadier." "He is steadier." Margaret pulled her son into a hug. "And whatever happens between me and him, he'll always care about you boys. That's not going to change. Promise." "Promise." Will was harder. At 14, he understood things his brothers didn't, and he was protective of Margaret in ways that sometimes bordered on fierce. "I need to talk to you," he told Caleb 3 weeks after the fever broke. Man to man. Margaret, who was nearby, started to intervene, but Caleb held up a hand. "All right." He looked at Will steadily. "Let's hear it." "My mother's been hurt before." Will's voice was tight with controlled emotion. "My pa, he wasn't. He meant well, but he wasn't reliable. He made promises he couldn't keep, chased dreams that never came true, left her to pick up the pieces every time things fell apart." "I know." "If you hurt her, if you let her down the way he did, I'll—" Will stopped, swallowed hard. "I don't know what I'll do, but I won't forgive you. Ever." Caleb didn't smile, didn't brush off the boy's threat. Instead, he nodded gravely. "You're right to protect her. She deserves someone who'll look out for her, fight for her. That's what a good son does." He paused. "And that's what I intend to do, Will. I'm not making promises I can't keep. I'm not spinning dreams. I'm offering your mother something real. A home, a partnership, a future built on solid ground. Is that enough for you?" Will studied him for a long moment. Whatever he saw in Caleb's face must have satisfied him, because slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. "For now," he said, "but I'll be watching." "I'd expect nothing less." After Will left, Margaret came to stand beside Caleb on the porch. "You handled that well." "He's a good boy, protective of his family. I respect that." "He wants to trust you. He's just afraid." "So am I." Caleb's arm slipped around her waist, a gesture that was becoming familiar. "But we don't let fear make our decisions, do we?" "No." Margaret leaned into him. "We don't." February brought thaw both to the land and to something inside Margaret. The frozen shell she'd built around her heart was melting, and what emerged was raw and tender and alive in ways she'd forgotten she could be. She and Caleb took walks in the evenings when the work was done, talked about everything and nothing, learned the rhythm of each other's thoughts. He kissed her for the first time on Valentine's Day, a soft brush of lips that made her knees weak. "Was that all right?" he asked, pulling back to search her face. "More than all right." Margaret pulled him back down for another kiss longer this time. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I've wanted to do that for months," Caleb admitted. "Then why didn't you? Didn't want to rush you. Didn't want to be another man making demands before you were ready." Margaret touched his face, traced the lines around his eyes. "You're nothing like anyone else, Caleb Harrison. Nothing at all." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and Margaret felt something settle into place inside her. Not certainty exactly, but something close. A sense that she was finally where she was supposed to be with the person she was supposed to be with. The crisis came in early March without warning. A rider arrived at the ranch dusty and travel-worn, bearing a letter. For Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, from Vernon Sullivan, Silver Falls. Margaret opened it with trembling hands, a sense of dread pooling in her stomach. "What is it?" Caleb asked, watching her face go pale. Margaret couldn't answer. The words swam before her eyes, each one a blow. Vernon was claiming guardianship of her sons. He'd hired a lawyer in Helena, filed papers with the territorial court. As their closest male relative, he argued he had a better claim to raise them than a penniless widow living on another man's charity. The hearing was in 3 weeks. If she lost, she would lose her boys. The letter fell from Margaret's fingers. She couldn't feel her hands, couldn't feel anything except the cold spreading through her chest, freezing her from the inside out. "Margaret." Caleb's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Margaret, what is it?" She opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. The words in that letter had stolen her voice, her breath, everything. Caleb picked up the fallen paper. She watched his face as he read, watched it harden into something dangerous. "That son of a—" He stopped himself, his jaw tight. "He can't do this. He's doing it." Margaret's voice came back hollow and strange. "He's their uncle, their closest male relative. In the eyes of the law be damned." Caleb crumpled the letter in his fist. "Those boys belong with you. Anyone can see that." "Can they?" Margaret felt herself starting to shake. "I'm a widow, Caleb. I have no property, no money, no husband. I'm living on another man's charity. Vernon has a business, a home, standing in the community. What judge is going to choose me over that? Any judge who takes one look at those boys and sees how much they love you. Love doesn't matter to courts. Security does. Respectability does." The shaking was getting worse. "He'll take them, Caleb. He turned us away in a blizzard, and now he wants to take my children." Caleb crossed to her in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. "He's not taking anyone. Do you hear me? We're going to fight this." "How?" "I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out." His arms tightened around her. "You're not alone anymore, Margaret. Whatever comes, we face it together." She clung to him, let herself fall apart for just a moment, let the tears come. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to find a way to keep her sons. The news spread through the ranch like wildfire. By evening, everyone knew. Mrs. Abernathy's face went white with fury. Charlie swore fluently in 3 languages. Even the ranch hand's rough men who rarely showed emotion looked grim. "That no-good snake," Mrs. Abernathy spat. "Vernon Sullivan wouldn't know how to care for a cactus, let alone 4 growing boys. This is about something else." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "I mean Vernon Sullivan doesn't do anything without profit in mind." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes were sharp. "Those boys are old enough to work. Will especially. Vernon's been complaining for months about the cost of hired help at his mercantile." The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. "He wants free labor." "That's my guess. He'd take my children from me to save money on employees. Vernon Sullivan would sell his own mother if he thought he could turn a profit." Mrs. Abernathy's voice was bitter. "I've known men like him my whole life. They don't see people. They see assets." Margaret thought she might be sick. "Mama." Will's voice came from the doorway. He stood there with his brothers behind him, 4 faces ranging from confused to frightened. "What's happening? Why is everyone upset?" Margaret looked at her sons and felt her heart break all over again. How was she supposed to tell them? How was she supposed to explain that the uncle who'd turned them away now wanted to rip them from the only real home they'd ever known? "Come here, boys." She gathered them around her, pulled them close. "I need to tell you something." She told them, simply honestly, without softening the truth. They deserved that much. Will's face went hard in a way that made him look like a man, not a boy. "I won't go. He can't make me." "Will." "I mean it, Ma. I'd rather live on the street than live with Vernon Sullivan." His voice shook with controlled rage. "He threw us out, left us to freeze. Now he wants to pretend he cares about us." "It's not about caring." Tommy's voice was quiet, his mathematical mind already working. "It's about control, about money. He needs workers and we're free." "I don't want to leave." Benjamin's eyes filled with tears. "I like it here. I have friends here. The horses know me now. I want to stay with Mama." Henry crawled into Margaret's lap, clinging to her. "Don't let him take us, Mama. Please don't let him." "I won't, baby." Margaret held him tight, looked at each of her sons in turn. "I will fight this with everything I have. I promise you that." "We'll fight together," Will said fiercely. "All of us." "All of us," the others echoed. Caleb stepped forward. He'd been standing back, letting Margaret have this moment with her children, but now he moved to stand beside them. "I meant what I said. We face this together. All of us." He looked at each boy in turn. "I know I'm not your father. I'm not trying to be. But I care about you, about all of you. And no one is going to take you from your mother while I'm breathing. You have my word on that." Will studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he extended his hand. "Then we're in this together, sir." Caleb shook it man to man. "We are." The next morning, Caleb rode to Helena. "I know a lawyer there," he explained to Margaret before he left. "Good man, honest. If anyone can find a way to beat this, it's him." "Caleb, lawyers cost money. I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He took her hands in his. "And before you argue about charity, remember, this is about those boys, your boys. He stopped, swallowed. "The boys I've come to love like they were my own." Margaret's eyes burned. "You love them." "How could I not?" His voice was rough. Will with his fierce loyalty and his hunger to learn. Tommy with his clever mind and his careful heart. Benjamin who sees beauty in everything. Henry who reminds me every day what joy looks like. He paused. "They're yours, Margaret. That makes them precious to me." She couldn't speak, could only rise on her toes and kiss him, pouring everything she couldn't say into that single gesture. "I'll be back in 3 days," he said when they finally broke apart. "Hold the fort until then." "I will." She watched him ride away and felt the fear threatening to swallow her whole. 3 weeks. They had 3 weeks. The days that followed were agony. Margaret went through the motions of work, of teaching, of caring for her boys, but her mind was elsewhere, constantly circling the same questions. What if they lost? What would happen to her sons? How would she survive without them? "You need to eat." Mrs. Abernathy pressed a plate into her hands. "You're no good to those boys if you waste away." "I'm not hungry." "I don't care. Eat anyway." The older woman sat down beside her. "I know you're scared, Margaret. Anyone would be. But you can't let fear steal the time you have." "What if it's the last time?" The words came out cracked, broken. "What if this is all we get?" "Then make it count." Mrs. Abernathy's voice was fierce. "Don't spend these weeks in terror. Spend them loving those boys. Whatever happens, they'll remember that. They'll remember their mother fighting for them, caring for them, being present with them. That matters more than you know." Margaret looked at the woman who'd become like a mother to her and felt something shift. "You're right." She took a breath. "You're right." She started eating. Caleb returned on the third day as promised. He brought with him a small, sharp-eyed man named Samuel Whitmore, who carried a leather satchel full of papers and looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Mrs. Sullivan." Whitmore shook her hand briskly. "I've been reviewing your case. It's not hopeless." "Not hopeless." Margaret latched onto the words. "What does that mean?" "It means we have angles to work." Whitmore spread papers across the kitchen table. Vernon Sullivan's petition rests on several claims. First, that as the boy's closest male relative, he has natural authority. Second, that you lack the means to provide for them properly. Third, that living on a bachelor's ranch is improper for young boys. "Improper," Margaret's voice rose. "He left us to freeze in a blizzard, and he's calling this improper." "I know. The hypocrisy is staggering." Whitmore's lips thinned. "But we can use that. We can demonstrate that he abandoned you, refused aid when you were desperate. That speaks to his character." "Will the court care about his character?" "They might, especially if we can show a pattern." Whitmore looked at her directly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to ask you some questions. About your husband. About Vernon. About everything that happened before you came here." Margaret told him. Everything. The years of struggling. Patrick's death. Vernon's rejection. The door slammed in her face, the $20 thrown at her like scraps to a dog. Mrs. Patterson's cruelty, Ezra's kindness, the 15-mile walk through the blizzard. Whitmore took notes, his pen scratching rapidly. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "This is good," he said finally. "The abandonment angle is strong, but there's something else we can do. Something that would make your position virtually unassailable." "What?" Whitmore glanced at Caleb, then back at Margaret. "You could marry." The word hung in the air. Margaret felt her face flush. "I know it's forward of me to suggest," Whitmore continued, "but a married woman with a stable home and a husband of means, Vernon's entire argument falls apart. He can't claim you lack resources if you're Mrs. Caleb Harrison. Can't claim impropriety if the boys are living with a proper married couple." "Mr. Whitmore," Margaret's voice was carefully controlled, "I appreciate the suggestion, but I will not marry to solve a legal problem. If Caleb and I marry, it will be because we choose to not, because Vernon Sullivan forced our hand." "I understand. I simply wanted you to know the option exists." Whitmore began gathering his papers. "In the meantime, I'll file our counter-petition. I'll need character witnesses. People who can speak to your fitness as a mother to the boy's well-being under your care." "I can do that." Caleb spoke for the first time. "And I know others who will too." "Good. The hearing is in 18 days. I'll be in touch." After Whitmore left, Margaret and Caleb sat in silence. The marriage suggestion hung between them, unspoken but impossible to ignore. He's not wrong. Caleb's voice was quiet. About marriage making things easier. I know. But you're right, too. I don't want to marry you because of a court case. He turned to face her. I want to marry you because I love you. Because I want to spend my life with you. Because when I imagine my future, you're in every part of it. Margaret's breath caught. Caleb, I'm not proposing. Not now, not like this. He took her hands, took her. When I ask you to marry me, and I will ask you, it won't be because of Vernon Sullivan or any judge. It'll be because it's right. Because we're ready. Because we choose it freely. And if we lose the case before that happens, then we appeal. We fight. We keep fighting until there's nothing left to fight for. His grip tightened. I'm not giving up, Margaret. Not on you, not on those boys, not on us. Whatever it takes. She believed him. God help her, she believed him completely. The days blurred together. Whitmore sent letters, requested documents, built their case piece by piece. Margaret gathered testimonials from everyone who knew her. Mrs. Abernathy Charlie. The ranch hands, the parents of her students. Each one spoke to her character, her devotion to her children, the transformation she'd brought to Harrison Creek. Ezra Thornton made the 15-mile journey specifically to add his voice. That woman walked through a blizzard to give her boys a chance. He told Whitmore, his weathered face fierce. You don't do that unless you love those children more than your own life. Vernon Sullivan can't hold a candle to that kind of devotion. Even some of the townspeople of Silver Falls came forward. People who'd witnessed Vernon's cruelty that first day. People who'd seen Margaret turned away and had felt ashamed of their silence. I should have helped you. Mrs. Patterson, of all people, appeared at the ranch one afternoon. Her face was pale, her hands twisting together. That day you came to my boarding house. I knew it was wrong to turn you away, but Vernon, he has influence. I was afraid. Why are you here now? Margaret asked coldly. Because I can't live with myself if those boys are taken from you. Mrs. Patterson's voice cracked. I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of, Mrs. Sullivan. Turned away people who needed help. Put my reputation above what was right. But this, taking children from their mother to serve as Vernon Sullivan's unpaid laborers, I can't be part of that. You're willing to testify. I'll tell them everything. How Vernon spoke about you after you left. How he laughed about sending you off with $20. How he said he'd done his duty and washed his hands of you. Mrs. Patterson's chin lifted. It's the least I can do. Margaret wanted to refuse, wanted to throw this woman's tardy conscience back in her face. But she thought of her sons, of what was at stake, and swallowed her pride. Thank you, she said. That will help. The hearing was held in Helena on a gray March morning. Margaret wore her best dress, the blue wool Caleb had bought her for Christmas. Her boys sat in a row behind her, scrubbed clean and terrified, holding hands like they had during the blizzard. Vernon Sullivan sat across the aisle with his lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit. Vernon didn't look at Margaret, didn't acknowledge her existence at all. All rise. Judge Abraham Winters was 60 years old, with a face like carved granite and eyes that gave nothing away. He took his seat, surveyed the courtroom, and nodded. We're here in the matter of Sullivan versus Sullivan. Guardianship petition for William Thomas Benjamin and Henry Sullivan, minor children. Mr. Prescott, you represent the petitioner. I do, Your Honor. Vernon's lawyer stood. We're asking the court to grant full guardianship to Mr. Vernon Sullivan, the children's paternal uncle and closest male relative. Mrs. Sullivan, while no doubt a loving mother, lacks the means and stability to provide proper care for 4 growing boys. And Mr. Whitmore, you represent the respondent. I do, Your Honor. We categorically oppose this petition and will demonstrate that it is motivated not by concern for the children's welfare, but by Mr. Sullivan's desire for free labor in his mercantile business. The judge's eyebrows rose. That's a serious accusation. We have evidence to support it, Your Honor. Very well, Mr. Prescott, call your first witness. Vernon testified first. He painted himself as a concerned uncle, burdened by guilt over his initial refusal to help, now seeking to make amends by providing a stable home for his brother's orphaned children. "I was wrong to turn them away," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I've regretted it every day since. But I can make it right now. I have a successful business, a proper home, the means to give those boys every advantage." "And what advantages would those be?" Whitmore asked on cross-examination. "Education, stability, a respectable position in the community." "By education, do you mean formal schooling? Or do you mean training them to work in your mercantile?" Vernon's face tightened. "Both. A boy needs to learn a trade. And by working in your store, they would save you the expense of hired employees, wouldn't they? That's not... Isn't it true that you've complained publicly about the cost of labor, that you've been looking for ways to reduce your overhead? I run a business. Of course I watch my expenses. And 4 boys working without wages would certainly help with those expenses." "Objection." Prescott was on his feet. "Speculation. Withdrawn." But Whitmore had made his point. Margaret could see it in the judge's eyes. Witness after witness followed. Mrs. Abernathy spoke of Margaret's devotion to her children, her tireless work, her transformation of the ranch. Charlie described the boys' growth, their happiness, their flourishing under their mother's care. Ezra told the story of the blizzard, his voice rough with emotion. "That woman carried her youngest son through miles of snow," he said. "Gave him her food, her warmth, everything she had. If that's not a fit mother, I don't know what is." And then Mrs. Patterson took the stand. "I was there the day Margaret Sullivan came to Silver Falls," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious nerves. "I saw Vernon Sullivan give her $20 and tell her to leave. I heard him call her a burden. And afterward, I heard him laugh about it with his cronies at the saloon." Objection, hearsay. "Your Honor." Mrs. Patterson was present for these conversations. "I'll allow it. Continue." He said, and I quote, "That's the last I'll see of her. $20 to make her go away. Best investment I ever made." Mrs. Patterson's voice hardened. "This man didn't want those children when they were starving in the street. The only reason he wants them now is because they're old enough to be useful." The courtroom buzzed. Judge Winters called for order. "Mrs. Sullivan." He turned his attention to Margaret. "Do you wish to testify on your own behalf?" Margaret stood, her legs shaking. "I do, Your Honor." She walked to the witness stand and took the oath. Whitmore guided her through her story from Patrick's death to Vernon's rejection to the 15-mile walk through the blizzard. She spoke of finding work at Harrison Creek, of building a school, of watching her sons transform from frightened refugees into confident, happy boys. And then Vernon's lawyer had his turn. "Mrs. Sullivan, you currently reside on Mr. Caleb Harrison's ranch. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And Mr. Harrison is unmarried?" "Yes." "Isn't it improper for a widow with 4 children to live on an unmarried man's property?" "I have my own cabin. I work for my wages. There's nothing improper about it." "But you've been seen with Mr. Harrison, walking together, dining together. Some might say your relationship is more than professional." Margaret felt her face flush. "Mr. Harrison is a good man who gave me and my children a home when no one else would. If I care for him, that's not improper. That's human." "But you're not married to him." "No." "So these boys are being raised in an unconventional situation. A widow living on a bachelor's ranch, engaging in what appears to be a romantic relationship outside of marriage." Prescott's voice dripped with false concern. "Is that really the best environment for impressionable young boys?" "The best environment for my boys," Margaret said, her voice rising, "is one where they're loved, where they're fed and clothed and educated, where they have room to run and people who care about them. Mr. Harrison's ranch provides all of that." "But surely a proper home with their uncle—" "Their uncle threw us out in a blizzard." Margaret was on her feet now, all the fear and rage of the past weeks pouring out. Their uncle gave me $20 and told me to figure it out. Their uncle watched us walk away into the snow and didn't spare a single thought for whether we'd survive the night. Mrs. Sullivan. Vernon Sullivan doesn't want my children. He wants workers. He wants to use them the way he uses everyone else as tools for his own profit, and I will die before I let him do that to my boys. The courtroom was silent. Margaret realized she was crying, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't care. Let them see. Let them see what a mother's love looked like. Your Honor. Whitmore stood. We have one final witness. We call William Sullivan. Will walked to the stand with his shoulders back and his chin up. He looked so much like Patrick in that moment, but with something Patrick had never had. Steel in his spine, certainty in his eyes. William, Whitmore said gently, you're 14 years old enough to have your own thoughts about this matter. Can you tell the court what you want? I want to stay with my mother. Will's voice was clear, unwavering. She's the one who's taken care of us our whole lives. She's the one who walked through a blizzard to keep us safe. She's the one who taught us to read and made sure we ate even when she was hungry. And your uncle. Will's face hardened. My uncle is a stranger who shares our name. He's never cared about us, never visited, never wrote, never sent so much as a Christmas card. The only thing he ever gave us was $20 and a slammed door. And if the court grants him guardianship, then I'll run. Will's voice was flat with certainty. I'll take my brothers and we'll run. We'll find our way back to Ma no matter what any court says, because she's our mother and that's where we belong. The judge was quiet for a long moment after Will stepped down. He looked at the papers in front of him, at Vernon Sullivan, at Margaret, at the 4 boys sitting in the gallery. I've heard enough, he said finally. I'm prepared to render my decision. Margaret's heart stopped. This case is at its core about one question: what is in the best interest of these children? Judge Winter's voice was measured, thoughtful. I've heard arguments about means and stability and propriety. I've heard accusations and counter-accusations. But what I've seen more than anything else is a mother who would walk through fire for her sons, and an uncle who turned them away when they needed him most. He turned to Vernon. Mr. Sullivan, your petition speaks of concern for your nephew's welfare. But your actions tell a different story. You had the opportunity to help these children when they were desperate and you refused. You cannot now claim to care about them simply because they've become old enough to be useful to you. Vernon's face went red. Your Honor, I'm not finished. The judge's voice was sharp. I've also considered the testimony regarding your intentions. While I cannot prove that you seek these children for labor purposes, I find the accusation credible, given your history and character. He turned to Margaret. Mrs. Sullivan, you've demonstrated extraordinary devotion to your children. You've provided for them, educated them, and loved them through circumstances that would have broken a lesser woman. The fact that you reside on Mr. Harrison's ranch does not, in my view, constitute impropriety. You work for your living and maintain your own household. That is more than respectable. Margaret couldn't breathe. Therefore, I deny the petition for guardianship in its entirety. Custody of William Thomas Benjamin and Henry Sullivan shall remain with their mother, Margaret Sullivan, where it belongs. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. Margaret sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Then Will was there, throwing his arms around her and Tommy and Benjamin and Henry, all of them crying and laughing at once. We won, Ma, Will kept saying. We won. Across the aisle, Vernon Sullivan stood abruptly and stormed out of the courtroom. He didn't look back. Margaret didn't care. She had her sons. She had her home. She had everything that mattered. And when Caleb appeared beside her, his eyes bright with unshed tears, she had something else too. She had love. The ride back to Harrison Creek felt like a dream. Margaret sat in the wagon with her boys pressed close around her, unable to stop touching them, unable to stop crying. They were hers. The court had said so. No one could take them now. Ma. Will's voice was rough. You're crushing me. I don't care. She pulled him closer anyway. I almost lost you. Let me hold on a little longer. You didn't almost lose us. Tommy's hand found hers. We were never going to let that happen. We would have fought. All of us. I know, baby. I know. Caleb drove the wagon in silence, but every few minutes, he'd glance back at her, and the look in his eyes made her heart swell until it hurt. He'd stood by her through everything. Had spent his money on lawyers, had rallied the community to her defense, had never once wavered in his support. She loved him. The knowledge sat in her chest like a warm coal, steady and certain. When they reached the ranch, Mrs. Abernathy was waiting on the porch. One look at their faces told her everything she needed to know. Oh, thank the Lord. She rushed down the steps, gathering Margaret into a fierce hug. I've been praying every minute since you left. We won. Margaret's voice broke on the words. We won. Of course you did. Mrs. Abernathy pulled back her eyes bright with tears. There was never any doubt, not in my mind. The ranch hands appeared from every direction, drawn by the commotion. Charlie reached Will first, clapping him on the shoulder with rough affection. Heard you gave quite a speech in that courtroom, son. Will ducked his head, embarrassed. I just told the truth. That's all any man can do. Charlie's voice was gruff. Your pa would be proud. Margaret watched her son's face crumple for just a moment before he got control of it. These men, this place, had given Will something he'd been missing since Patrick died. Male guidance, respect, a sense of belonging. How close they'd come to losing all of it. That night, after the boys were in bed, and the ranch had settled into quiet, Caleb found Margaret on the porch of her cabin. She was wrapped in a shawl, staring up at the stars, her mind still spinning with the events of the day. Can't sleep. He settled beside her on the steps. Too much to process. She leaned into his warmth. This morning I thought I might lose everything. Now you've got everything. The boys, the ranch, the school. He paused. Me if you want me. Margaret turned to look at him. In the dim light, his face was all shadows and angles, but his eyes were clear. If I want you. Her voice came out incredulous. Caleb, you just spent a fortune defending my children. You stood by me when anyone else would have walked away. How could you think I don't want you? Because I need to hear you say it. His voice was raw. After everything, after the trial and Vernon and all of it, I need to know this is real. That you're not just grateful, not just relieved. That you actually want me, Caleb Harrison, with all my broken pieces and old grief. Margaret took his face in her hands, made him look at her. I love you. She said it clearly, deliberately, leaving no room for doubt. Not because you saved us. Not because you're kind or generous or any of the 100 other things you are. I love you because you see me. Because when I'm with you, I feel like myself for the first time in years. Because the thought of my life without you in it makes me want to cry. Margaret, I love you, she said again. Is that clear enough? Caleb's answer was to kiss her, deep and thorough and full of everything he couldn't put into words. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. I love you too, more than I thought I could love anything again. They sat together until the cold drove them inside, talking about nothing and everything, making plans for a future that suddenly seemed bright and full of possibility. Spring came to Montana with wildflowers and warm winds that melted the last of the winter snow. The ranch burst into life, cattle grazing in green pastures, calves being born, the endless work of a new season beginning. And Margaret's school flourished. Word had spread about the trial, about the widow who'd fought for her children and won. Parents who'd been hesitant before now sent their children, eagerly trusting Margaret with their education. By April, she had 18 students, and Caleb was talking about building a proper schoolhouse. You'd do that? Margaret stared at the plans he'd sketched on the back of an envelope. It's needed. Caleb shrugged like it was nothing. The old building's too small now. The children deserve better. Caleb, this would cost... I know what it would cost. He took her hands. It's worth it. You're worth it. The schoolhouse was raised in May, the whole community coming together to build it. Margaret stood watching as neighbors who'd once turned her away now lifted beams and hammered nails, their labor a kind of penance for their earlier cruelty. People change, Mrs. Abernathy observed, coming to stand beside her. Sometimes shame does what kindness can't. I don't need their shame. I don't need anything from them. No, you don't. But they need this. They need to feel like they've made amends. The older woman smiled. Let them have it. Forgiveness is lighter than grudges. Margaret thought about Vernon, who'd left Silver Falls entirely after losing the trial. Thought about all the doors that had been slammed in her face. And she let it go. All of it. The anger, the hurt, the bitter memories. She had too much to be grateful for to waste time on old wounds. You're right, she said. It's time to move forward. On the first day of June, Caleb asked Margaret to walk with him to the high meadow, where they'd talked that first time months ago when she was still his housekeeper, and he was still a lonely rancher pretending he didn't feel anything. What's this about? Margaret asked as they climbed the gentle slope. You're being mysterious. Am I? Caleb's voice was carefully neutral. You know you are. They reached the top, and Margaret caught her breath. Someone, probably the boys with Mrs. Abernathy's help, had set up a picnic. A blanket spread on the grass, a basket of food, a bottle of wine. Caleb, before you say anything. He turned to face her, and she saw nervousness in his eyes for the first time since she'd known him. This man who'd faced down blizzards and illness and legal battles, nervous because of her. I've been thinking, he said, about what Whitmore said during the trial, about how marriage would make things easier. Margaret's heart sank. Caleb, I told you I won't marry for convenience. Let me finish. He took her hands. When he said that, I was angry, not at him, at the situation, because I didn't want you to marry me for legal reasons. I wanted you to marry me because you loved me, because you couldn't imagine your life without me, because the thought of being my wife made you happy, not just safe. It does make me happy. The thought, I mean. Good. Caleb's voice was shaky. Because I'm about to ask you properly, and I need you to know this has nothing to do with Vernon or courts or any of that. This is just me, Caleb Harrison, asking the woman I love to spend the rest of her life with me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. Simple gold with a small diamond that caught the afternoon light. It was my mother's, he said. She told my father she'd marry him right here in this meadow 60 years ago. He gave her this ring and promised to love her until his dying day. He kept that promise. Margaret's eyes were blurring with tears. I'm not good with words. Caleb's voice cracked. Never have been. But I know what I feel. I know that before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions, waiting to die so I could see Rose again. And then you showed up with your boys, fierce and desperate, and so damn beautiful, and everything changed. Caleb, let me finish. Please. He took a breath. You taught me that it's possible to love again after loss. That grief doesn't have to be the end of everything. That there's room in a heart for old love and new love both. You and your boys, you've made this ranch a home again. You've made me want to live again. He held up the ring, and his hand was trembling. Margaret Sullivan, will you marry me? Not because it's practical, not because it solves problems, but because I love you more than I've ever loved anything, and I can't imagine another day without you by my side. Margaret was crying openly, now tears streaming down her face, but she was also smiling, her whole body light with joy. Yes. The word came out fierce and certain. Yes, I'll marry you. Caleb slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, while the wind whispered through the meadow grass, and somewhere in the distance, birds sang. When they finally walked back to the ranch, hand in hand, the boys were waiting on the porch. Their faces told Margaret they knew exactly what had happened. "Did he ask?" Tommy demanded. "He asked? Did you say yes?" Benjamin was bouncing with impatience. "I said yes." The boys erupted in cheers. Henry launched himself at Margaret's legs, clinging tight. "Does this mean Mr. Caleb is going to be our papa now?" Margaret looked at Caleb, who was watching the boys with an expression of such tender longing that it made her chest ache. "That's up to him," she said. "What do you say, Caleb? Are you ready to be a father?" "I've been ready since the first day you walked through my door." Caleb's voice was rough. "If the boys will have me." Will stepped forward, the same serious expression he'd worn in the courtroom. "My father wasn't perfect," he said slowly. "He made a lot of mistakes, but he loved us in his way. I don't want to forget him." "You won't." Caleb met the boy's eyes. "I'm not trying to replace your father, Will. No one could do that. But I'd be honored to be part of your family to help guide you boys as you grow up to be there when you need someone to lean on." Will was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he extended his hand. "Welcome to the family, sir." Caleb shook it man to man the same way he had months ago when Will had warned him not to hurt Margaret. "Thank you, son." The wedding was held on the first day of July in the meadow where Caleb had proposed. The whole community came, ranchers and townspeople, and even a few faces Margaret didn't recognize. Father Murphy traveled from Helena to officiate, his weathered face beaming as he watched the couple exchange their vows. Margaret wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Abernathy had been secretly sewing for weeks. Her hair was loose, crowned with wildflowers the boys had picked that morning. She'd never felt more beautiful. "You sure about this?" Will asked as he prepared to walk her down the aisle. "Last chance to run." "I've never been more sure of anything." Margaret squeezed his arm. "Thank you for being here, Will. For walking with me. Where else would I be?" His voice was gruff, but his eyes were bright. "You're my mother. I'd walk through fire for you." "I know, baby, I know." The ceremony was simple, the vows spoken clearly under the wide Montana sky. When Father Murphy pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed Margaret with a tenderness that made her knees weak. "Mrs. Harrison," he murmured against her lips. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." The celebration lasted well into the evening with music and dancing and more food than Margaret had seen in one place. The boys ran wild with the other children, their laughter ringing across the meadow. Mrs. Abernathy danced with Charlie, shocking everyone. Even the most reserved ranchers loosened up as the wine flowed and the stars emerged. "Happy?" Caleb asked as they swayed together in the firelight. "Completely." Margaret looked around at the scene, at her sons, healthy and whole and belonging, at Mrs. Abernathy, who'd become like a mother, at the community that had finally fully embraced them. "I keep waiting to wake up. This doesn't feel real." "It's real." Caleb pulled her closer. "Every bit of it. And it's just the beginning." Summer turned to fall, and fall to winter, and with each passing season, Margaret felt her roots sink deeper into Harrison Creek soil. She taught her students, watched them grow and learn and discover the world through books. She helped Mrs. Abernathy run the ranch house, took over more and more duties as the older woman's health began to fail. She lay in Caleb's arms at night and woke in them each morning, and the miracle of it never faded. And she watched her sons transform. Will, at 15, was nearly a man now. He worked alongside the ranch hands with easy competence, his skills growing daily. Charlie had started teaching him the business side of ranching, and Will absorbed it like a sponge, his quick mind finding the patterns in cattle prices and feed costs. "He's got a head for this," Charlie told Margaret one evening. "Could run this place someday if he wanted. He might want something else entirely. Maybe, but he'll have the choice. That's what matters. Tommy discovered a passion for medicine after helping treat an injured horse. Caleb ordered him books on veterinary science from Denver, and Tommy devoured them, eventually asking if he could apprentice with the doctor in Silver Falls. "Are you sure?" Margaret asked. "It's a long way to ride every day." "I'm sure, Ma. I want to help animals. Maybe people too someday." Tommy's eyes were bright with purpose. "I think I found what I'm meant to do." Benjamin's drawings covered every wall of the ranch house. He'd developed a talent for capturing the Montana landscape, the horses, the daily life of the ranch. Caleb had sent some of his sketches to an artist friend in San Francisco, who'd responded with enthusiasm and an offer to mentor the boy when he was older. "Your son has real talent," the letter had said. "With proper training, he could go far." And Henry, sweet little Henry, simply flourished. He followed Caleb everywhere, chattering constantly, asking endless questions. Caleb answered every one with patient attention, teaching him to ride, to care for animals, to be kind and strong and good. "Papa Caleb," Henry had started calling him. The first time he'd said it, Caleb had turned away quickly, but not before Margaret saw the tears in his eyes. On a cold December evening, 1 year after Margaret had first arrived at Harrison Creek, she sat with Caleb in front of the fire, a truth burning in her chest that she could no longer contain. "I have something to tell you." Caleb looked up from the book he'd been reading. "What is it?" Margaret took his hand and placed it on her stomach. For a moment, he didn't understand. Then, his eyes widened, his breath catching. "You're pregnant." Margaret's voice trembled. "About 3 months along. The doctor confirmed it yesterday." Caleb's face underwent a transformation. Joy, fear, hope, and terror all flickering across his features in rapid succession. "A baby." He said it like a prayer. "Margaret, a baby." "I know you're scared." She covered his hand with hers. "After what happened with Rose. But this is different. I'm healthy, the doctor says everything looks good, and I'm not going anywhere." "You can't promise that." "No, I can't. But I can promise that I'll fight like hell to stay. For you, for the boys, for this baby." She tilted his chin up, made him look at her. "I've lost a lot in my life, Caleb. I know what grief feels like. But I've also learned that fear can't stop you from living. You taught me that." "I'm terrified." His voice cracked. "The thought of losing you?" "Then be terrified. And stay anyway. Love anyway. Hope anyway." Margaret kissed him softly. "That's all any of us can do." They told the boys at Christmas, gathered around the tree, in a scene that felt like a deliberate echo of the previous year. A baby. Will's face was unreadable. "A brother or sister for you boys." Margaret watched them carefully. "How do you feel about that?" "I feel like this house is about to get a lot louder," Tommy said dryly. Benjamin grinned. "I'm going to teach the baby to draw—" "Can I name it?" Henry demanded. "I have good ideas, like Thunder or Captain." "Those are horse names," Will pointed out. "They're good names." Laughter rippled through the room, easing the tension Margaret hadn't realized she was holding. "We'll figure out the name together," she promised. "All of us, as a family." Will was quiet for a moment longer. Then slowly a smile spread across his face. "A baby," he said. "Our family's really growing. It really is. I'm glad, Ma." He met her eyes, and she saw the boy he'd been and the man he was becoming all at once. "You deserve this. You deserve all of it." Margaret pulled her eldest son into a hug, not caring that he was almost too big for such things now. "Thank you, Will. For everything." The baby came in August, on a day when the Montana sky was clear and blue and endless. Margaret labored for 12 hours, Caleb never leaving her side, his hand in hers, through every contraction. "You're doing so well." His voice was steady, but she could see the fear in his eyes. The memories of another woman, another baby, another outcome. "I'm going to be fine." Margaret gasped through the pain. We both are. And they were. Rose Margaret Harrison entered the world screaming, her tiny fists waving in fury at being evicted from her warm home. She had Caleb's gray-blue eyes and Margaret's auburn hair, and she was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever seen. A girl. Caleb held his daughter with trembling hands, tears streaming down his face. Margaret, she's perfect. She is. We should name her after... He stopped, swallowed hard. After Rose. Margaret understood without being told. Your first wife. Our daughter's namesake. You wouldn't mind? I think it's fitting. Margaret touched the baby's downy head. Rose Margaret. Honoring the past while building the future. I love you. Caleb's voice broke. God, Margaret, I love you so much. I love you too. Now bring me our daughter. I need to hold her. The boys crowded into the room an hour later, fighting over who got to hold the baby first. Will won by virtue of being the oldest, cradling his tiny sister with infinite care. She's so small, he said wonderingly. Was I ever this small? Smaller. Margaret smiled at the memory. You were born early, fit in the palm of your father's hand. I'm going to protect her. Will looked up, his expression fierce. I'm going to teach her to ride and read and everything else. She's never going to feel unsafe or unwanted, not while I'm around. I know you will, sweetheart. Tommy examined the baby with clinical interest. Her vital signs look good. Strong grip, clear eyes, good color. Doctor, Sullivan already making diagnoses. Caleb ruffled his hair. Save some for medical school. Benjamin was already sketching, capturing the scene with quick, sure strokes, and Henry just stared at his new sister with wide eyes. She's really going to stay? He asked. Forever. Forever. Margaret reached out to pull him close. She's part of our family now, just like all of you. Good. Henry nodded decisively. I like having a sister. Can we teach her to say my name first? We'll see, baby. We'll see. Later that night, after the boys had been shooed away to bed, and Mrs. Abernathy had fussed over mother and child. To her satisfaction, Margaret lay in the quiet room with Rose sleeping in the cradle beside her, and Caleb stretched out in the chair he'd refused to leave. I keep thinking about a year ago. Margaret's voice was soft, drowsy. Standing in the snow outside your door, sure I was about to be turned away again. Sure my boys and I were going to die out there in the cold. I remember the first time I saw you. Caleb's voice was equally quiet. You looked half dead, but your eyes were fierce, determined. I knew right then you were something special. I thought you were going to refuse us, the way everyone else had. I almost did. The confession was painful. I was so closed off, so determined to stay alone. But then, I looked at your boys, at their scared faces, and I remembered what it felt like to lose everything. I couldn't do that to someone else. You saved us. You saved me right back. Caleb reached for her hand. I was dead inside, Margaret, just going through the motions. You brought me back to life. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them here. 400 miles of grief and dust. A brother-in-law's cruelty. A town's rejection. A 15-mile walk through a blizzard. And at the end of it all, home. I spent so many years surviving, she said slowly. Just getting through each day, hoping things would get better. But this, what we have now, it's more than surviving. It's living, really living. It is. I never thought I'd have this. Never thought I deserved it. You deserve everything. Caleb lifted her hand to his lips. Every good thing in the world. Baby Rose stirred in her cradle, making small snuffling sounds. Margaret reached down to touch her daughter's cheek, marveling at the softness, at the miracle of new life. She's the future, she said. Ours and the boys. Everything we build, everything we create, it's for her, for all of them. Then let's build something worth inheriting. They sat together in the quiet darkness, two people who'd found each other through loss and desperation, who'd built love from broken pieces and hope from ashes. Outside, the Montana night was vast and star-scattered. Inside, a family slept safe and warm and whole. Margaret thought about all the doors that had been slammed in her face. All the times she'd been told she wasn't wanted, wasn't worthy, wasn't enough. She thought about Vernon Sullivan and Mrs. Patterson and all the others who'd turned away when she'd needed help most. And then she thought about Caleb, about Mrs. Abernathy, about Ezra Thornton and Charlie McBride and the community that had finally opened its arms to her and her children. The world was full of cruelty, yes, but it was also full of kindness, full of second chances and unexpected grace, full of people who chose love over fear, generosity over greed, hope over despair. She'd found those people. She'd found her place among them. She was home. Margaret fell asleep with her husband's hand in hers, and her daughter's soft breathing filling the room, and her last thought before dreams took her was not of the past or the future, but of this moment, this perfect present, this life she'd fought for and earned, and would never ever take for granted. The rejected widow who'd knocked on a stranger's door had become a wife, a mother of 5, a teacher, and a pillar of her community, and she would never be alone again.